Good morning, I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche organization with your daily video update for September 23rd, 2022. Today's Friday, so I'll be taking some questions that I've received from the viewers, and I encourage you to keep the questions coming in because it's very important for me to get a sense of what you're thinking and what your responses are. Now, the first question is about the upcoming referenda in the 4 regions of Ukraine that were called for by President Putin in his speech last week. The question is, most of those who oppose Russia are condemning the referenda. What about the referenda that took place in Kosovo back in 1991? Now, it's true. What's being said is that this is a sham. It's a fraud being conducted by Russia. But the same people who say that are the ones who say that Ukraine is the first armed conflict in Europe since the end of the Second World War, that it was an unprovoked attack, and so on. Now, to say that there was no conflict in Europe ignores what happened around Kosovo in the 1990s, as Kosovo at that time was used as a part of the Western assault against Russia. Now, Kosovo was a part of Yugoslavia. And the NATO chose to move in to defend the separatists in Kosovo in 1991 to 1999. There was a referendum in 1991 for independence in Kosovo, and there was conflict between Serbia and Kosovo as Serbia was trying to prevent the breakup of the Yugoslav Empire at that time. Now, what happened is that in 1999, there was a Western assault, which was NATO and the US, almost 100 days straight of bombing of Serbia. And in the end, Serbia was forced to accept the independence of Kosovo, despite the fact that there were in Kosovo armed Islamic terrorists. Now, this is not exactly a one-to-one correspondence, except to show the complete hypocrisy. Why was a referenda acceptable then and not now? What does this say about the rules-based order? What does it say about democracy? And whose rules? Who benefit from this? The important point is that the decision on Yugoslavia was imposed by the United States and NATO, knowing full well that Russia opposed the breakup of Yugoslavia. This was, in a sense, a part of the post-Soviet period of the encroachment of NATO on Russia. And that's why it's worth bringing up today, because it does represent another example of the blatant hypocrisy of the defenders of using Ukraine as a sledgehammer against Russia. Now, the second question was on the UN General Assembly. What exactly is going on there? Is it true that Russia is isolated? Now, the European leaders and Biden focused almost exclusively on this question of Ukraine and demonizing Russia. Biden did throw in, we need a Build Back Better policy. There were some attacks on China from European leaders. But it's interesting to compare what the leaders of the European nations said compared to those of the rest of the world. For example, from African nations, from Kenya, from South Africa, and several other countries, the Congo, they were saying we should be focusing on ending sanctions and cooperating for economic development. And a discussion, especially around the idea of sovereign nation states, that this would be to put an end forever to the legacy of colonialism. So these are countries that had refused to submit to the so-called rules-based order and have refused to submit to the demands from the United States and Europe that these nations support the sanctions against Russia. So you can see the division that we've been reporting between the global South, the former non-aligned nations, and those of the former colonial powers who are still insisting that their former colonies adhere to their policies. And so we can see that, including from Bolsonaro, the president of Brazil, who said the war must end, there must be negotiations. which Zelensky in his speech said there will be no negotiations until Russia accepts his terms. Well, how do you have diplomacy if you have that kind of rigidity? Now, I think this was made clear by Liz Truss, the new unelected Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, whose speech was basically democracy versus autocracy. Now, she made a comment there that I think people really should listen to and think about what this reflects. She said, the G7 and our like-minded partners should act as an economic NATO, collectively defending our prosperity, unquote. Now, the first obvious question, Mrs. Prime Minister, is what prosperity? The people in the United Kingdom are suffering terribly on the effects of inflation, of energy shortages, of hunger. So where is the prosperity that you're defending? You're defending the prosperity of the City of London. Now, this calls to mind the statement made by King Charles when he was still Prince Charles several months ago at a Davos World Economic Forum meeting, where he said the fight for the Green New Deal and the Great Reset, in order to accomplish this, we need a vast military-style operation. And it makes clear that what we're seeing with the deployment of NATO military forces and the insistence on adherence to a rules-based order is to defend an economic policy which benefits the richest nations in the world at the expense of not only the poorer nations of the world, but the poor and middle class in the rich nations. A vast military-style operation. That's what we're seeing with the policies of Davos and the World Economic Forum, which go back to the decisions made from the 70s and 80s to eliminate the idea of national sovereignty. And as George H.W. Bush said after the first Iraq War, we now can create a new world order. A new world order in whose benefit? The idea of a sole superpower and the idea of a European, NATO, US domination. Now, there's a question from Jeremiah, who said that LaRouche warned after the US-NATO assault on Libya in 2011 that Ukraine is more dangerous as Russia is the target. And he wrote that LaRouche also warned that the Western economies were under attack, but that war would be used as a distraction. And an example of this is what Lyndon LaRouche said in January 2001, when he warned that the economic crisis that will come in with the Bush administration will cause them to use a Reichstag fire type event, which happened 9 months later on 9/11. The idea that war is a distraction, that you can impose austerity under conditions of war. Now, he said, you've been reporting on demonstrations and opposition growing in Europe. Why not in the United States? Is this the effect of media control? Well, that's part of it. But it's also that the United States has had a period of general prosperity for a number of years. But increasingly, you've seen the erosion of the middle class, especially after the 1980s, with the free trade policies, the globalization, the privatization, the deregulation, where you've had increasing flows of wealth to the wealthiest, away from those who are the producers. And so you've had a very slow process of degeneration of the economy. And people have been trying to make adjustments. There's a lot of unhappiness about it. But the real problem is in the American political system, everything is channeled through two parties. And the two parties represent one basic commitment, which is to the unipolar superpower of the United States. And so you may have left versus right, phony divisions, but more importantly, you have the effect of so-called identity politics, which is superimposed on everything to focus people on sex and gender, to focus them on religious and racial and ethnic divisions, locales, which part of the country you're in, the coasts versus the center of the country. You have these divisions that have been created that have been superimposed over and above discussion in the political arena. If you bring up certain issues, you're ignored. Now, LaRouche ran for president 8 times, and he was absolutely accurate in his assessment on the breakdown of the US economy. And yet he received almost no media coverage except attacks. And so when you have that kind of censorship, and then at the same time this push to divide people, it's hard to think about how you could unite the country. I'll give you an example. In 2009, 2010, when the bailouts were going on and Obamacare was pushed through, you had one division between left and right, where you had people who were fighting who agreed on basic principles. For example, the Tea Party and Occupy Wall Street both opposed the bailouts and both opposed Obamacare. But instead of unifying around a broader economic approach, which LaRouche had drafted with his 4 laws, instead they fought each other over particulars. And those kinds of divisions remain in the United States. And that's what the media uses when you have so-called conservatives saying that Biden is a socialist or a communist. Biden's an incompetent spokesman for globalist imperial interests. He's not a socialist. Corporatism, which Biden is a frontman for, in other words, bankers' socialism, is actually fascism. But people can't discuss that. That's not part of the economic discussion. And that brings me to the last question, which came in from someone who asked about the triple curve. What do you mean by financial aggregates, monetary and monetary aggregates? Now, LaRouche's triple curve function is based on the idea that as you move into a bubble economy and move away from a physical economy, there are volumes of debt which are created in the form of new financial instruments, whether these are stocks, bonds, or more wild things such as derivatives and swaps and things of that sort. You have being bought and sold bets on the direction of the economy and bets on the direction of individual financial paper backed by nothing. And so those are the financial aggregates. And those have been on a very extensive upward curve, especially since the post-Volcker period of the high interest rates. But going back to the change in 1971, where the dollar was removed from a gold standard or a gold reserve, and where floating exchange rates were implemented, handing the reins of power to central banks that operated to defend the speculators, such as George Soros, such as the City of London. And so financial aggregates grew. And we were told that's a sign of wealth. Every time the stock market went up, we were told that's new wealth. Now, at a certain point, someone has to back up those financial aggregates. If they're bought and sold, sometimes people will ask, well, what's backing this up? And so periodically, there needs to be a pumping of monetary aggregates, that is money, so that these things can be bought and sold and kept at some approximation of face value. Because otherwise, if you have these financial aggregates, there's several quadrillion dollars worth of these things floating around being bought and sold every day. If you have that, and someone starts to say, well, what happens if the margin calls are not met? What you would have would be a crashing chain of defaults. And so money is necessary periodically to be pumped in to back that up. So you have financial aggregates going like this and monetary aggregates going up with it at an increasing rate. Now that's what causes inflation, because the credit is being created to back up paper, to back up worthless assets. In the meantime, there's no credit for production, and the productive sectors of the economy are being dismantled. For example, what we see in the attack on fossil fuels with the Green New Deal, what we see with the shutdown of the steel industry, the fertilizer industry. machine tool production, which is collapsing across the board in the Western economies. Those are the motors of real growth. And if you shut them down and instead focus solely on protecting the farcical values attributed to these financial instruments, you create an inflation. And not just an inflation, a potential hyperinflation. And that's why what Lyndon LaRouche proposed after 2008 is put the whole thing through bankruptcy. Put the banks that have these trillions of dollars of derivative assets carried on their books, let them justify the values attributed to them. This takes a little bit of time because you have to see whether someone's willing to pay for something. This is what happened with Lehman Brothers. All of a sudden, people said, well, we can't trust Lehman to repay their debts, so we're going to call them in, have a margin call with them. And it was clear that Lehman was bankrupt. But the CEO of Lehman at that time, when he was confronted with this, knew that every other bank was in a similar situation. And he said, so now I'm the schmuck, referring to the fact that it was every bank and investment bank, the universal banking system, that was carrying these worthless assets. And LaRouche said, put it through bankruptcy reorganization and make the bankers eat the losses. Don't bail them out and don't put the expense on the population by shutting down the real economy. So that's what we need to do today. That's what the new Bretton Woods is about. And I would encourage people, go to our website and read up on this. We have a wonderful video of LaRouche's addresses over the years that's available on the Schiller Institute website. And I'll put a link at the bottom of the description page so you can study this and see why it is that LaRouche was attacked so much over the years, because he was the true opponent of this financialization policy, because he promoted instead his vision of what the American system was all about. So thanks for joining me. Thank you for your questions, and I'll see you again next week.